So much no. No. What's up with parts of life?
It's great.
What is it?
Do you follow it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, best Instagram.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, best Instagram ever.
Is it kind of like the Dirty Duck? It's like kind of like quirky and funny. Is it one where like they're just taking pictures of like red? Yeah, exactly.
Because I got to do an introduction.
Oh, no.
For a minute, and I'm just waiting for him to take pictures now.
You gotta take the shoes off. I'm getting the shoes with the glasses.
Oh, okay, right on. Ah.
Wait, was like,
Just a moment, ladies and gentlemen. We're pausing for a photo shoot. And we're back to the first annual Karma Cup Speakers Series in conjunction with the 5th annual Karma Cup. And today we're actually going to talk about something that is really important. We are just over a month away from legalization. And we live in a city where a lot of people do not own their own homes, and in fact, they do rent. We also have, so as we're seeing a lot in the news these days, cannabis growing and cannabis consumption on their properties at all. So we have actually got Karima Saad, as she's an up-and-coming lawyer in the cannabis space. She's already working with some really great activists and educators in the space, and as well as from anywhere from patients to recreational users. So she's got a little introspective stuff on law and politics and everything that's kind of made up, the racism that's made up cannabis prohibition. And she is here to talk to us on this very complicated, very important, and very convoluted subject, what it's going to mean for recreational users, what this might mean for patients, and what your rights are as a landlord, as a homeowner, and as a tenant. So thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Tracy. So sort of piggybacking on something Tracy mentioned, but if by show of hands or spirit fingers, can I get a sense of how many people are renters in this room? Okay. And do we have any homeowners? Okay. And here we have it, the competing interests between landlords and tenants. And that is going to be, I think, a prevailing theme in the political and legal landscape after cannabis legalization. So what I hope to do in this presentation is touch briefly on the rights and obligations of both landlords and tenants, how the competing interests, any questions that audience members may have as we embark on this new era of non-prohibition, which is, an exciting change. On the one hand, you have landlords who may be concerned about what the legalization of cannabis will bring about. So if the government, the federal government has said 4 plants per household, regardless whether it's recreational or medical use, medical users will continue to have whatever prescription or license they have until such time as that regime is changed. And obviously smoking and consuming cannabis, other tenants will be disturbed. And the landlord-tenant game is ultimately a business. It comes down to a bottom line. And while there is a social and human rights aspect to housing, and that's why tenants are afforded a great deal of rights and protections under the Act, the prevailing principle is that it is a business. And from that perspective, landlords have perhaps reason to be concerned about how their business may be impacted. There are a lot of, I think, conceptions, whether they're misconceptions or whether they're accurate, about growing and how having a grow up within a home can create all sorts of damage, be it mold, damage, water, overconsumption of electricity. In fact, there are some insurance policies of landlords that when growing is now allowed at home, there will be tenants who do this in an irresponsible way. And just as an aside, in my own personal practice, I do deal with both landlords and tenants, and so I can vouch for the fact that there are great people on both sides and there are huge jerks on both sides. And I think that the landlords, for their part, are worried about the jerkish tenants because, not done properly, there can be a lot of costly damage that accrues from a grow-up if it's not conducted properly. The propriety is sort of the key issue, though. Tracy mentioned there are condo boards, and condo boards are sort of a separate beast, so we'll get to that in a minute. But there are landlords as well, including Toronto Community Housing in our own city. Its statement is one that I think will cause a lot of strife between landlords and tenants at the Landlord-Tenant Board. As I said, there may be exemptions for medical users, and I think that in the large scale, it's just as it's medical patients who were the driving force behind legalization. As we develop and figure out and sort out the rights and obligations of tenants and landlords with growing and consumption, again, I think we'll see medical patients at the forefront of these discussions. So just as a point, I think that any sort of ban on either growing or smoking that doesn't include an exemption for medical users right off the bat is unconstitutional and will be challenged. So already there is some leeway, and if a medical user is permitted, then what truly is the distinction between that and someone who consumes for recreational purposes? Why is it that their rights might also be infringed? There's a standard at the Landlord and Tenant Board known as reasonable enjoyment, and that's the bottom line when it comes to assessing whether a tenant's behavior is interfering with somebody else. So if the conduct is so problematic or concerned about grow-ops, you can imagine in an apartment building, if a tenant is growing irresponsibly, they're not really paying attention to water levels, or the plants aren't elevated off the floor and it's bearing a hole or it's causing mold, how that could impact other tenants and not just be a headache for the landlord in terms of their own costs, but affect other people who are also in a living situation, some of whom may have no interest or desire to have any involvement with cannabis. So we have to look at things from that perspective a little bit. And the way of solving this, in my mind, and you'll hear this sort of repeated throughout the course of this presentation, is the idea of mutual respect and cooperation. And landlords, for their part, if you do have tenants, rather than setting out a blanket ban, you may want to establish some parameters. You may want to call for or suggest that there be inspections. If a tenant is intending to grow, that they notify you that you have an opportunity to grow up potentially harmful or dangerous versus what precautions can be taken to minimize the impact, so that it's barely any different than growing a tomato plant, maybe just a bit more work and effort on the part of the gardener, but fundamentally not different than having a home garden. And home gardens themselves can be sources of mold and damage. So again, stepping back from the notion of cannabis as this wildly and drastically different substance or plant. Even if it is a unique plant and it is a special one, but it's not inherently harmful or dangerous. And I think that a lot of the hoo-ha surrounding legalization and what's going to happen come October 17th, I think that it'll take some time falling, and that a lot of their investment is protected. Tenants, for their part, an obligation, again, to not interfere with substantial enjoyment of the landlord or other occupants, being cognizant of how you are undertaking your grow. And the same things that I suggested that a landlord educate themselves, it applies to tenants as well. There are ample resources, whether it's in person at the hydroponic store or online, YouTube, websites, whatever, being aware and mindful of how and what measures you can take to protect the people around you. Smoking sort of falls in it's a little bit different in the sense that it's not it's an intangible almost effect. So the smoke dissipates and it leaves a smell, and it can seep into walls. From that perspective, again, a landlord might be cautious about what's going on in their unit. A blanket ban, once again, though, especially if there is no such prohibition on cigarettes, I think would not stand up to any scrutiny if it was brought before a court. The reason I say that is because it's not. There appear to be some attempts to draw arbitrary distinctions between cannabis smoke and tobacco smoke. Again, TCA owes this massive change on many people who have been residents for decades. I don't think it's going to fly. And there will probably be challenges. And stepping back a bit, I guess, for those unfamiliar with how the law works in the landlord-tenant area, there is a special tribunal, and both about enforcing rights. Landlord cannot harass or pester you or allow somebody else to do that to you. They can't change your locks without your permission. A variety of rights going to your security and peace of mind and enjoyment of the unit. And there's also maintenance obligations on the part of the landlord. So if a landlord isn't, cannabis and smoking comes into play, is if a landlord wants to evict someone for interfering with others, smoking could potentially be one of those reasons if it's at a level where it's not a reasonable amount, or if your lease stipulates that you're not going to engage in that behavior and then you do and it's bothering someone, that could be a reason to end your tenancy. So when Toronto Community Housing says that, okay, no more smoking of anything in our units, whether it's tobacco or something else, they are unilaterally imposing a change on leases for people who have been there for many years. The world will look like if more people are smoking in their units. And so no, that is a. I think, and the reason that I say this is because we're talking about changes that are being proposed now. So balcony fires are a very real and valid issue, and so on and so forth. But the idea that they're proposing to ban all smoking in the wake of legal. Yeah, enjoyment doesn't just apply to people who don't want to, smell in their unit. It also applies to someone who may not be able to smoke elsewhere. And that's actually a good segue to talk about that there's actually not really anywhere you can smoke if you're not allowed to smoke in a rental unit, and you're not allowed to smoke in public or outdoors. And if they shut down vapor lounges, it creates sort of a pickle for someone who doesn't have anywhere else to go. And earlier we spoke about condos. They're a really interesting situation to whatever constitutional or legal constraints. So if a condo board votes and decides, then even homeowners against the condo board, because there's no legal relationship there. And I think that that's where we're going to see a lot of litigation. The landlord-tenant board, again, it deals mostly with evictions and enforcing tenant rights. So we will see some cases that come out of there that impact how landlords and tenants relate to one another. But condo is really where we're going to see the meaningful charter, and charter being the constitutional charter of human rights, Canadian rights of charter and freedom. All of those words are just fusing in my head. Getting someone out. And the application forms themselves are very technical in nature. It requires that's Jesus in the city for anyone who it's so we'll just let that pass for a second. Oh, right. Sorry, it's a parade. I wasn't being facetious. There is a parade currently. All of the roads are shut down. It was such a nightmare to actually get from the west side here today. Identify yourself if you are a medical patient, and if you intend to be growing, we want, full or unabated rights of access. We'll notify you and we'll come check in, and we have to know at all time how many plants you have, and we want to see proof of your medical conditions, and a long laundry list of things that are very personal, real determination about your needs as a patient. And so that has been, my office has tried to do some pushback on policies like this, pointing out that the reason for legalization comes down to medical patients who have a right to bodily autonomy and to decide how they medicate, as long as it's within the parameters of what's prescribed by a physician or a doctor, and that's not something that should be up for debate. And there are obviously two sides to this concept, and just as a caveat, none of this is legal advice, but I am trying to shed some light on the considerations that a court might have when deciding whether this kind of notice is valid. So the first thing that a court would look at is following proper board and protocol procedure. If all is sound and proper, and actually you just live somewhere where the condo community as a whole isn't really open to the idea, then we're looking at the substance of the actual bylaws or rules. And is there an exemption for medical patients? That's the first question. If there's not, that's something to attack right away, regardless of how you use the plant, because where such an exemption doesn't exist, you're basically posing an unreasonable restriction on something that goes to the safety and security of an individual. And so that Section 7 charter right, going to the really, really fundamental bodily integrity, and what two directions you have to take. First of all, looking at the exemption, is it one that is unduly intrusive and infringing on that privacy, such that it's not really an exemption at all, it's more of a burden and imposition, and it's still curbing the right in a meaningful way, because if no one feels comfortable participating, then you're effectively denying. So if those regulations are too strict, that could be a line to challenge this. if the regulations are adequate and you're not a medical user, you're just someone who likes to consume or wants to grow or whatever, what have you, that's where we're going to see all types of new cases, because everything we've fought and won so far has had to do with medical. And now that it's a substance like any other, the question is what's different now and then, because 5 years ago, if you were a recreational user and there was a complaint against you for smoking cannabis in your unit, it's an illegal act. So that in and of itself is enough to potentially get you out of the place. Now that it's no longer an illegal act, I've mentioned the substantial interference. But if something isn't, not just landlord-tenant, we'll see it in employment law, we'll see it in family law, we'll see it all over the place. But that's what it's going to come down to. And circling back to the notion of preventive measures, and this is a big change in society. Ending a prohibition is a change, and there's no getting around that. And so the idea of coming from a place of caution and let's see how things go and unroll slowly, has validity to it. And that's where I just want to briefly discuss the origins of prohibition, because I think that that's something that's not widely discussed or known, and it on the sense of we have to be careful. In the early 1900s, we saw a lot of immigration to Canada from Asia, in particular Chinese immigrants. And there was pushback to that in the mostly white areas of the port cities. So I'm thinking Vancouver in particular. And that stemmed from xenophobia and racism. So if you take a glance at headlines of sort of Asian men measures against in particular Asian men. So it was a targeted piece of legislation. And once that ball started rolling, it extended to other drugs as well. And we saw a similar phenomenon happening in the United States around the same time with cannabis and the Hispanic and Black populations, and it was seen sort of as a danger in that it was a threat to innocence, and that's how it was phrased and framed, and that's where a good deal of stigma gets wrapped up. And in terms of the enforcement laws surrounding cannabis in particular, the racist and systemic origins of that are still carried out to this day. So even though it's used statistically in sort of equal parts across racial demographics, when someone gets arrested for cannabis, it's the officer who has discretion, and that discretion is often applied in a way, and we can see this through, I'm not a statistician at all, but the data generally shows that if you have black or brown skin, to be detained or arrested versus let off with a warning. But if you haven't already visited this website or seen this petition, pardon me? Oh, did he? I missed him. Okay, never mind. So I won't be redundant. But anyway, the enforcement patterns really have had a disproportionate impact on racialized and otherwise vulnerable people. And I haven't even mentioned sort of the Indigenous element in Canada, where cannabis, which had cultural significance, was banned, and certain traditions were outlawed in the Indian Act as well, and that was done as a part of sort of cultural stifling. And so where prohibition has these origins and not actually tied to any science or evidence is that my office is taking on, there were some evictions that we managed to prevent for a medical patient who was growing. In this particular case, the license had lapsed, and so there was a valid argument that it was actually an illegal act that he was committing. However, the way that he conducted his grow was very responsible, and we managed to have sort of a report to that effect, and where the landlord was alleging that it caused all the damage that it didn't actually cause, we were able to go on a review, again dealing with a medical grow, and here there was a ton of evidence, like 9 hours of testimony that was provided about this mold, and it was a serious mold issue in the unit, but the question was whether the mold started in 2014 before any plants existed, and then whether the plants themselves contributed and caused and made the problem worse. And in the original order, it was found that the landlord hadn't been able to prove that for a short period of time. And again, there were from Toronto Police about know if you have a grow-op near you, and it listed some potential damage that could result, and one of the points was mold. And based on this pamphlet, the reviewing member decided that actually, it has the causation has been proven, and it's definitely the mold and the marijuana, they're related, and that's the problem. So he reversed this decision, which gave $10,000 to the tenants, making it so that the tenants actually owed the landlord $3,000. So it was a total flip and reversal. And right now we're at the stage medicinally, and how hard it will be or how easy it will be for a landlord to prove that that's the source of the problem. At this stage, it makes sense to open up.
Shirelli, I wear a number of hats here. I write the O Cannabis News and Views blog, and also I'm on a condo board, and I was fighting a rather interesting move by our board, as directed by its property manager, who's a member of OREA, O-R-E-A, Ontario Real Estate Agency, and they represent landlords and all these other people, and are supposedly, they often advise the condo boards whose buildings they manage too on the issues. And this came complete with a presentation with legalization happening and mad hordes of marijuana smokers running up and down the walls of the building, and all this sort of nonsense. And they developed what's called a rule in government, and that still haven't been changed, that would allow any of these rules to be passed by the board, and they would become law unless they were opposed within 30 days by 15% of the population of the building, the owners, I should say. I know it's a little different than with apartments and all that, but I'd like to deal specifically with this issue. Now, I had to kind of improvise and just do this on the fly, and I fought it on the medical pot angle that, I see in court, and also on, the sanctity of home issue, which actually kind of had a broader appeal. But they were trying to grandfather, say, no, it's not a problem, because anyone who smokes or tokes now, they were including tobacco with this too, can declare now, and then they will be exempt, but when they leave the building, their unit becomes available, they sell it or rent it out, then it's a different story altogether. The rule takes place. And I said, well, like as a medical cannabis patient, I don't have to you have no right to ask me, kind of flying it here, I'm not sure, but to make me sign something that, I'm a smoker or whatever. And I said, when you have people of color, who I don't see any here on our board, are they going to want to step forward and go, oh yeah, I smoke marijuana all the time, and so do all my kids, right? Like, it's just not a realistic thing. Now, I suspect there was some going back and forth with lawyers and things. Unfortunately, they backed down, and they're going to redo this as a part of some kind of smoke-free law for the building now or something like that. So I guess what I would like to know is what resources are available for people in condominiums that way who may need legal recourse. I mean, I'm sure I can't go to my board and say, let's sponsor you to come in and tell us why this is bullshit, right? But they just
for sure you can offer
I would gladly.
I would love to have a guest session at your condo.
Well, I'll get your card before you go. I think I have it already. But I mean, I noticed there was a whole, I'm sorry I'm talking more, I'm supposed to be asking questions here. But first of all, what do you know of this, do you know any background on this constitutional thing where it can be PAC, who some of you may remember from a number of years ago, very diabolical figure who's back to make our lives unpleasant. I think it was, yeah, he lost the election by 100,000 job cuts, I believe. But now he's back to pass all these laws. He's got a lobbying group, and you can go Google them or check them on the internet and everything else. And they had a whole little media campaign going throughout Toronto. There were a number of articles. The only one that was sort of progressive I saw was in Now magazine. And then there was one other one that kind of looked at what the impact could be for homelessness, I think, and people of different persuasions and things like that, but it wasn't a real whole lot of research or anything. It was just sort of like a big smear campaign that came out, and I know they were really pushing for these laws to be passed before the Senate vote, and I noticed they're still continuing now. Apparently a lot of condo boards are still being gunned, and I know in our case they've backed down, but they've retained some other firm, and we're waiting for additional patients in condo boards. What should they do when they find out that, this kind of a rule has been passed? By the way, they sneak things by it. They put you in your mailbox a little notice and say you have 30 days, and most people take the thing and throw it in the garbage without reading it. So don't. And also you're allowed to go to your condo board meetings and all sorts of things too, but most people, of course, don't. So I'm wondering, could you advise us accordingly on what we might do with that?
Well, a lot to unpack. No, that's okay. I mean, in terms of resources, that is a very good question, and I'm actually not aware of anything that specifically caters to that, and that might be a void to fill, because it is sort of an important time right now. While positions, and some of the rules that came out in BC, one of them is that at law, if a lease banned smoking, like that includes cannabis automatically, and that's not the case in Ontario yet, but it is one that will impact a ton of people, I think. And yeah, so lobby groups have power. That's yeah, that's the bottom line there. Even to say it is kind of difficult, because it does again require someone to step out and identify. That's the opportunity to really challenge, because if you do miss sort of those technicalities of the 30 days and now it's settled law and that's that, then when an enforcement happens, you have to fight against that enforcement, just like we have all the criminal law cases which are foundational to legalization. So too we're going to have enforcement prosecution.
Right. You were saying that you thought that a lot of this might be fought out at the condo level. Why was that?
Simply because condos can pass their rule more as a community and co-op. And I think just like we can have communities of, and people may opt into a smoke. Sorry, so your question is,
why should people that do want to smoke weed, right? Why should they impose themselves upon the public? Like this is.
Well, I think just by merely existing, though, that's not an imposition. It's sort of the mutual respect and consideration.
And I was, it's more a comment that I'm going to make, and then I have a couple questions, but. There are things that cannabis smokers, cannabis growers, cannabis businesses can do. As you'll see along the walls and along the ceilings in here, you've got some pretty powerful carbon filtration air systems. So I keep telling people, if you want to make money in the cannabis industry right now, look into air filtration, because there's going to be a lot of money in that. Yeah. But those are also things you can do as a condo tenant. Someday, this will actually kind of work into my question or my comment. So we're talking a lot about public consumption, landlord, tenant boards. One of the things that, as a patient advocate, I've seen, and it's actually been since January 1st of this year, is that I have a lot of medical marijuana patients that can no longer vaporize or consume cannabis on hospital properties in Ontario at all. In December, they were allowed to medicate. As of January 1st, a lot of hospital policies changed to be in compliance with the Ontario Smoke-Free Act, which has now included cannabis and vaporizers. So we may actually start to see, so now we have bans in hospitals, and we're also seeing that we may have bans in long-term care homes. Sick people already tend to, so this kind of breaks into a little bit, is sick people already tend to be marginalized when it comes to housing. Do you think medical cannabis patients will now become discriminated against in the housing market?
Legalization brings with it more rules remedied in the short term. Appealing to an individual sort of long-term care facility owner is perhaps one thing, but to challenge the legislation in a more substantive way, it requires either political will, and where there are vulnerable groups, usually the political will is somewhat diluted, and there is a challenge, like the charter challenge or a constitutional challenge, taking a law to Superior Court and saying this law adversely affects this group and disproportionately so and unfairly so, and therefore needs to be amended. Yeah. And then, that's how we've seen a lot of changes generally in cannabis policy and regulation. So that might be...
early on in my career, there was once a bylaw sponsored by Rob Ford that was calling, and actually another city councillor who's still on the board, that would call for the fining of landlords if their tenants had grow-ops in their apartments. And Matthew Murnau and I actually went to City Hall and said, okay, well, first of all, what's a grow-up? Is it one plant? Is it 200? What does that mean? But again, it was a situation where it would have marginalized patients that were legally allowed to grow. Mm-hmm. If all of a sudden their landlords were like, well, I might be up to a $50,000 inspection fee from the city in fines if I allow you to grow in my home. So luckily that was abolished and it didn't happen. That was almost 15 years ago. But we're seeing kind of that happen now again, and we're kind of wondering where it's going to fall this time is a bit of a concern. So I'm hoping back to court we go.
It's sort of perverse that ends up being an impact of legalization, that it's actually more difficult, and in that way recreational does screw it up for everyone.
Well, and actually it's the patients that are, as part of the discussions that'll happen is from a landlord tenant from public consumption, patients will be targeted now because not everybody will smoking in public, it'll just be patients, and so therefore they'll be more visible. And we'll see how that goes, whether or not there's actually going to be harassment of any kind. The fact that we are looking at brick and mortar access in other provinces when we still don't have brick and mortar access for patients. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things wrong with legalization. I love the fact that we're doing it, but we all have some issues if you know the underlying issues of how we got here.
I think as it came to pass, and, as it unfolds, it's being more driven by not the interests of medical patients, which is how we got to this point, but more from a sort of a profit and...
Yes, very much is, very much my goal has always been dignified access, and unfortunately we're over patients. In the case of legalization, so that was actually in the works last year. They were looking to introduce the Apartment Act that could give the landlords the ability to ban smoking all across Ontario in shared dwelling domains. So I'm kind of wondering if that's tied to.
Yeah, if it has passed, they're not enforcing it.
Yeah, because what I'm interested in is the fact that a lot of these properties are not only trying to ban it in the apartments and on the balconies and those kinds of things, but actually even in the public smoking spaces.
Yeah.
And as we look at that, even with the ban on public consumption, as a medical marijuana patient, I've often been allowed to medicate where tobacco products were used in public spaces.
Then, at the very least
Fined.
approached and potentially if you have a card and an officer who uses their discretion, then maybe not even a fine, but still that interaction is in and of itself intrusive. If you're trying to just get from point A to point B, and on the way you have to stop and talk to an officer and possibly pay a fine, and possibly, if you don't have your card with you, be taken to the station.
And as we talked about cannabis amnesty, depending on what your previous interactions have been with the police, that could be triggering in a number of different ways. Yeah, if you want to come up and use the mic. Ask questions. But I think they appreciate you and your shoes.
For
Do you want to say it from there?
yes, you can have like time options. So even in a public space, right? Like from the morning time, which is like 8 a.m. or 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., you can have no smoking zones, right? And then after 9 p.m., it can be smoking is allowed. So it creates this opportunity for everyone that wants to use that space to use it, but at the same time, you're not really changing the public day-to-day life right away, because that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. And I would rather be polite and kind about this, because we've already got it legalized, and go about it that route, than agree to and be like, okay, yeah, that's fine, cool.
I think in being in any sort of
And
public...
medical is so that's everything you're bringing up from medical. Those are things that should be like, you should never be allowed to get kicked out for medical reasons. So that's a whole different category. So this is just for recreational. Like on the medical side, yeah, you need to fight for your rights on every single aspect. That's fair. But yeah, I would point that out.
Does anyone else have any more questions? Right?
I'm just going to ask, do you see, from your perspective, anything, an argument for reasonable access with the rec market kind of coming forward? Do you see kind of any openings there?
What do you mean by reasonable access for the rec market?
So with medical, we can kind of access it anywhere we want. Nobody asks a question. Where now you have, like with rec, you're kind of limited. You can't smoke in the pub, you can't do this, you can't do that. Whereas legal, it's a legal situation, but you have these bylaws in these cities putting up all these laws.
Well, what we're saying is that we're not even sure it's going to be like, there's going to be harassment for medical as well.
Any allergy situations going right to the top for reasonable access on the rec side. With medicinal, it's a little bit obvious, like I need to medicate myself. Whereas the rec side, it's a bit...
So I guess, like, would a recreational user have a court case against public consumption, or maybe home access under maybe Section 7, I guess is what he's asking?
Yeah, I think that potentially. I mean, I'm not even sure it's so obvious that someone medical, it is that obvious, but it's not always that obvious. It then comes down to sort of the individual liberties of a person. And sort of it ties into your question of, can we accommodate by having sort of these time zones or, however you were to structure that. But anytime you're in a public space or living in shared accommodations, you have to expect some level of nuisance, right? Whether it's, I don't like babies and I don't like the sound of them crying and I wish it would stop, or curry powder, or...
Very often the comparison we have when people complain about the cannabis smell, the cannabis user will automatically go around like, well, I don't like it when my neighbor cooks fish.
Right. And so it's you put up with some level of stuff just by being in a society. So that's kind of one thing. And then how do we balance that person's interest of not wanting to be affected by, this change? And then, this change really comes from a place of it never maybe should have been illegal in the first place.
But we're battling against
right?
almost a century of fear-mongering and prohibition. So, there are people that have families that are like, but the cannabis smoke will get to my children, and my children will go to school, and my children will go to school high, even though that apartment is 4 doors down and not connected to the same ventilation system, but because they could smell it. So I think, again,
the instinct to protect your children or your family, like that's a good thing. People should nurture that. That's fine.
And so, again, we've talked about is that give and take between your neighbors. It's like, I'm a cannabis user. if like the smell bothers you, and I've done this as a medical patient. If the smell bothers you, let me know. I'll look into air filtration or something to make sure that it doesn't bother you. Because really, an air cleaning kit that you can get for your 1-bedroom apartment is, about the same investment as a volcano. But it'll keep your neighbors happy and may keep your landlord off your back.
Mutual respect and cooperation.
Mutual respect and cooperation, exactly.
And just sort of, on the point about families, please be careful with your edibles and don't be the person who lets
Absolutely.
Because that's going to ruin it for everybody.
Yeah.
Just, anyway. Anyway.
Oh, yeah. Being safe with your cannabis is an important thing, especially if with your neighbors. We're going to talk about, we'll talk about this tomorrow. There'll be issues with outdoor growing. There's going to be all kinds of issues that are going to come up in the next 5 to 10 years regarding legalization. You are going to be a very, very busy woman. You've certainly chosen the right specialty, I think, is where we're going down along this route line.
As an aside, if anyone has any questions that they weren't wanting to ask,
you may know her if you visited one of Toronto's local vapor lounges. She used to be a bong tender just like the rest of us. And then, took with a passion for cannabis photography and social media, and has now organically grown her followers to over 42,000 followers, and has spent the last year turning. And she is one of the most present to you, and as part of the Karma Cup speaker series. For those of you watching online, you may not know her. Marley, also known as Tweedledoob. So we can put this. You can sit at a table. You can sit anywhere you want.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for that lovely introduction.
Do you need a vape pen? Do you need a volcano?
I would love a vape pen.
How about a shatterizer? Shatterizer do?
Sure, whatever you got. I've been at the Karma Cup Festival actually all day so far, just working at the 7 Acres Lounge. So I've been talking all day and not smoking. So I could use a toke and some water, I think, before I do this. So I'm really excited to be here to talk to you guys today about social media. I actually did my, and I don't know if some of you are expecting to see Jack Lloyd here today, the lawyer, but he was unable to make it from Vancouver. So Tracy asked me to come last minute and fill in. So I'm going to talk to you mostly the same talk that I did yesterday, except that was to a room half full of suits. So I'm going to modify it a little for you real cannabis people. As Tracy said, my name's Marley. Some of you might know me more as Tweedledoob. If I had known that I'd be called my Instagram name in real life so much, I probably would have chosen something a little bit less ridiculous. But my Instagram account, I have, as Tracy said, organically gained about 42,000 followers. I started out in the industry working in a cannabis lounge just like this called Vape on the Lake in Etobicoke. At that time, I was going to the U of T full time, and social media wasn't really my thing at all. It was not on my radar. So even I'm kind of shocked that I've gone from being terrified of social media to smoking weed on the internet just for fun, and kind of turn that into a viable career path. I did not really see it coming, but I couldn't be more excited about what's happening in the industry right now. So I can skip over that part for the thing. All right. Oh, thank you, Tracy. No worries. I don't have to explain to you guys what a vapor lounge is since we're sitting in one, but I didn't know that they existed until I moved to Toronto in 2012. I'm from Alberta. At the time, I had already smoked weed for about 10 years, but I had no idea that Toronto had such a vibrant and active cannabis community. And I really didn't think I was going to like Toronto when I moved here, but it was really the community that made me fall in love with it, and that's why I'm still here 6 years later. So we can kind of fast forward my first 2 years working at the Vapor Lounge if we're focusing on social media here. do you guys know Spliffs Mackenzie? I don't know, anybody knows Spliffs Mackenzie? Awesome. So today she has about 60,000 Instagram followers. In 2014, she started working at Vape on for months. We talked about it a lot, and I was just like, I just remember the physical feeling of anxiety I used to get thinking about posting myself online smoking weed. It just made me very uncomfortable. I'd already smoked for 10 years, basically supervised Toronto stoners at the lounge for 2 years. Did I say that right? I smoked for 10 years. I worked at the lounge for 2 years. Very comfortable walking down the street smoking weed, but like I said, the whole idea of cannabis social media, you're amazing. Thank you, Gareth. Oh, that didn't even really work. There we go. Okay, so Spliffs eventually convinced me to make an Instagram account. And for the first whole year, I wanted it to be cannabis focused, but I was still too paranoid to post anything about myself really at all. So I knew that I had a pretty cool job working out. But it actually took me, the thing that really made me push to post more about myself and force myself to kind of get comfortable with posting selfies and posting more about my life was interviewing Sarah Hanlon for the cover of High Canada magazine in 2016. Sarah Hanlon fans in the house? Yeah, hell yeah, she's the best. So as some of you obviously know, she went into the Big Brother Canada house in 2015, and that was right around the time when I started my account, and I was super inspired by her. If you scroll way back in my Instagram feed, you'll see that some of my first posts were about Sarah and how cool it was that somebody that worked in a vapor lounge is on this very lounge, she's on national TV, talking about cannabis, talking about the lounge, totally normalizing it. And not only did Global kind of like accept that and like, yeah, they called her a employee, and people were in Toronto, I think enough people know about the lounges, but across Canada, kind of outside Vancouver and Toronto, the vapor lounge or the cannabis lounge is a totally novel thing. People don't know that it exists at all. So it was so exciting to see her just be open about it, and really to be like, she was one of Canada's favorite players. She was like beloved for her strategy, her humor, her social game, and she wasn't seen as like the stoner in a bad way. It was kind of the most active breaking the stigma that I had really ever seen. And while I was on the show and say, oh, your daughter's such a stoner, weed's bad, or they would go and say, hey, your granddaughter's amazing, she's doing so great. Like, the fact that she was open about cannabis wasn't as divisive as people kind of think. Like, I think sometimes as cannabis users, we expect to be judged and expect for that. And if they don't like weed, they're not going to like us. But I think people are sort of starting to come around to it. And it's, if you can show that you're not just a lazy stoner that sits in the basement all day, if you can actually show that you're, you know, a productive member of society and also a cannabis user, I think that's like really inspiring and really productive for kind of the movement. So I'm wondering, I don't know how into participation you guys are right now, but I'm wondering if you guys want to put up your hands if you are you're obviously a cannabis user, but if you're like open about it and people in your life know that you smoke weed, are you loud and proud, or are you kind of, okay, so maybe like half and half? I think that there's for sure a lot of totally reasonable reasons why people are not open about their use, whether it's your job or your family or whatever. I think it makes a lot of sense for some people that they can't just talk about it. But some of you that didn't put up your hands were probably like me and really just internalized the stigma. So I was really concerned about people like discrediting me for like just being a pothead, and I didn't want people to see me like that. And after talking to Sarah, I kind of started to realize, like, you know what, that mindset is actually perpetuating the stigma. Like, I'm not doing anybody any favors here. So if I know that like like I was going to one of the best universities in Canada and working full-time or working part-time and like doing all these things that I think the average person would think is like, you know, I'm doing all right. I'm not just sleeping all day, but it took time to sort of get used to being public about it and putting stuff online. But like coming out of the cannabis closet was actually a huge turning point for me. And I obviously wouldn't be here today talking to you guys if I was still really concerned about being judged for how much I love weed, which is a lot. So hang on one second. Hi, Rena. Amazing. That's perfect. Okay, so after my first year or so, I think I had about 1,000 Instagram followers. And when I started to not just post more pictures of myself, but post more about myself and my life and what I was kind of up to, I think that's when I really started to gain momentum. And as things started to take off, I started taking it a bit more seriously and putting more time into it. And there's not really one thing that was like, this was a turning point and then I blew up. It was kind of like this gradual kind of gaining of momentum. And I think there was kind of this magic storm of a bunch of different things that helped that happen. One of the things I think is that, like, I don't know if you guys can kind of relate to this, but there's like some accounts online, not just cannabis accounts, but if they just post pictures, like you kind of see it as an account. Like this is like a weed account and there's no face to it. There's no person. You're like, oh, I like the content, but you don't connect with it because you don't know who they are or what they're all about. And I think I realized that in the way I consume Instagram content, the people that I like the most really share a lot about their own story and their journey. And the more that you kind of feel like you're getting a behind the followers that, like, just as a number, I was sort of starting to gain connections with the cannabis community in Toronto, across Canada, and in the States and around the world. Somehow, of my 42,000 followers, only about half of them are in North America. So there's like 20,000 people internationally that follow me as well. So knowing that, I really try to like showcase Toronto's community because I think it's so powerful. Like the fact that we're all sitting here in a room and can like be open about our cannabis use and vape and just hang out. I think that's a really novel thing across Canada, but more so internationally. So being able to use social media to kind of normalize cannabis and to show what it could be is like super exciting to me. So around the same time, model of camera or search different things you want to learn about, and it is all right there. A million different people make tutorials, and you can totally get into it that way. So as the quality of my photos started to improve, cannabis brands to do product photography and event photography. 2 years ago, I started one of my first like big gigs was actually working for the Karma Cup, doing social media and photography. So yeah, I think those kinds of things have sort of helped me gain a little bit of credibility, and it has really helped me feel a bit better about that. Like even though I still don't know exactly what my like career is going to be or what I'm going to do in 5 or 10 years, just the cannabis community has given me the confidence that I know like this is the place that I want to be, and if I just keep doing what I'm doing and keep kind of pushing, then I'll figure it out. So I think that's yeah. So the next kind of game changer, I would just like get all weird and nervous and not really do it, but I realized that it's actually a very, very effective way of communicating. I could write a big whole long caption on a photo and like not everybody's going to read it for one, but people that do read it, writing inevitably leaves something up for interpretation. So we have to interpret the tone. We may not get the kind of nuance. You don't know what people are really taking away. And in video, I can, in 10 or 15 seconds, I can say something, people can see me and hear me and get the tone and expression. And I think it's a lot easier to connect with people. And it kind of goes back to contributing to like people seeing me as a person and like not just a weed account. And so I think that's helped people kind of relate to me and connect to me. Blah, blah, blah. So I don't know exactly when I like became an influencer. There's no really clear definition of the term, and it has always felt lame to refer to myself as one, but people message me all the time asking to promote their brand. So I guess that's kind of boils down to what it is. So whatever. Monetizing my social media has always been something I've wanted to do. Like, who doesn't like money? But I've been really hesitant about how I go about it for never heard of or whatever. I'm very skeptical because A, I don't know about the product and I can't vouch for it. And two, if I don't know the people, I'm not confident. I don't want somebody that I suggest to try a brand to have a bad experience. And literally that's all it takes is like one time you tell people to go to this website and it's sketchy or whatever. Or people have a bad experience one time. I think it's like can do irreparable damage really to your reputation, and online that's kind of all you have really. So the like my integrity and kind of the earned trust of my followers is like very important to me. So it's made monetizing it somewhat difficult. I turn down most of the offers that people make me. Makes me wish that Instagram was more like YouTube where you get paid for views and it's just easy. But I mean, for Instagram, you could have 50,000 followers and like if you don't have the hustle, like you're not making any money. I think people there's some misconception. People think, or if you have 100,000 followers, you must be rich. But it's sort of standardized or formalized, and there's going to be a lot more money in social media ad campaigns from like huge corporations. I mean, they're already seeing traditional like print and TV advertising decline a lot. And we use social media pretty much like we used to watch TV, right? I know that's kind of how I watch Instagram stories. It's like my favorite TV shows, but like they're real. Okay, I think that's pretty much like my story part of it. I have a few points, sort of some takeaway tips for. There's no real formula. There's no one way to like gain Instagram followers or to like become an influencer or anything. But I think these are just a few things that for me have really helped kind of along the way. The first thing I want to talk about is content, because really without content, like what are we even talking about? There's a lot that could be said here, and if you guys have any specific questions about content, or I would really like for you to ask. We watch movies, we watch TV, we read books, we love to gossip, we love to share things that happen to us in our day. Like stories are a very like basic unit of communication that we use all the time. And so like I said, I watch Instagram stories sort of like TV. So you get to see these little snippets of all these little stories every day. But if you follow somebody to see the big picture story, and people that have followed me for years, I got tons of incredibly kind and supportive messages from people. And like people that I've never met in countries, who knows where, being like telling me that they're like so proud of me. And it's so cool. Like, it's such a crazy thing to feel that, like, these people, like, they know my story. I don't know them, but, like, I've put enough out there. And if you kind of are following along and seeing somebody's journey as it unfolds, I think it's a powerful kind of tool.
So what's kind of awesome about this is I had questions printed for you, and you pretty much answered almost all of them.
Awesome.
Although there's a couple here.
Sometime, that's for sure. You know what? I've never really calculated it. I'm kind of like in the morning I'll spend some time, and then throughout the day I probably spend at least an hour a day, maybe split up over time. But when I was first starting my account, maybe like winter 2016, kind of I was first getting into it, I was spending an obscene amount of time online. just engaging and connecting and getting into the whole thing.
It was awesome to kind of hear your story, because the funny thing is, I remember the first time you messaged me, it was like, I kind of knew your account. I liked your name. It was kind of cool, blah, blah. And then you messaged me, and then once I met you, I was like, and it changed, because once you know who you're following, their account becomes more interesting.
For sure.
I love some of the funny things you post. You post some great like Lego figures and weed, and you post some awesome little stories and awesome little photos. But the you is what drew me in. And again, you mentioned Sarah Hanlon, who was awesome, and unfortunately she can't be here this weekend. But again, that was one of the things that was great. It's like, seeing her described as an employee. The realization of watching, it was a sign of a cultural shift, because she was on primetime TV, not after 11 o'clock, talking about cannabis and talking about what it was like to be a bud tender and a bong tender, and what it was like to work in a kind of like a bar for weed, and actually see how much Canada loved her and supported her throughout that, and how much global TV did too. It was really a sign of a cultural shift, and all she was doing was being herself in these fabulous gold pants. Right? Like,
she always has the best outfit.
Yeah. And if you haven't watched things where I watched it, and I thought, people judge the stoner all the time, and there were people that were in the house that judged her.
Oh yeah.
But the majority of
they
Canada,
discounted her in the first couple of weeks. They're like, oh yeah, like she's just the stoner. Like, don't worry about her. She's not a threat. And then she killed them.
And the amount of support that she had, not only in this space, as we all watched her win in this space that the night she did it, but to realize, when you start to realize that, wait, most of the stigma and the propaganda and everything else is because you've heard one person in 50 say it.
Yeah.
And they really, the people that are actually against us and against the, they're actually the minority. They're just really freaking loud.
Yeah, for sure.
So don't pay attention. The other one is we've seen a lot of cannabis Instagram accounts get suspended. Do you take any precautions in keeping yours safe, or is there a way to make sure that, you keep it safe?
I like how you worded that, because okay, so cannabis accounts are not protected by Instagram's terms and conditions. They consider any cannabis content, even if it's completely legal where it's posted, to be breaking the terms and conditions because it promotes the use or sale of drugs. But Instagram is not going through millions of accounts being like, oh, do you post about weed? Delete, delete, delete. It's 100% complaint based. So you have to have some haters reporting your account to get deleted. So my precaution that I take is like not being a dick.
I was like, don't be a dick.
And like if people like troll me, like there's haters now and again, like somebody just writing some like cheap comment or just like whatever. And like those people more than anything probably just need a hug or a friend. Like if you troll, they want you to react and they want to get into some like battle with you because they have nothing better to do. So if you don't engage with that and don't like fight back, you either, if it's something like disgusting and offensive, like delete it for sure. But if somebody has something to say that I can kind of like come back and be like, hey, like I'm sorry that you feel that way.
With people on your social media. I do not have that grace and poise. At all. I am very reactionary, but you do. And I've actually seen you turn around some people on some of your threads and stuff.
I love it.
Some pretty horrible haters that all of a sudden became giant Tweedledee fans.
Or they're just like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, so if you want lessons in diplomacy, you certainly want to check out your Tweedledee's Instagram account. And if you want to see pictures of really great nugs as well, and really what it's like to some position right now that you're transitioning, you are doing what a lot of people in the industry are trying to do, is you're transitioning from a semi quasi legal, wasn't legal, what is a job,
Yep.
Into this new space where,
Yeah, it's pretty
I
crazy.
think it's funny where you're like, I'm not sure what my job's going to be. Social influencer might still be a career because we don't know who thought it was ever going to be one in the
Not
first
me.
place.
You never know.
Anybody else have any more questions for Tweedledee?
Hey.
Marley.
Hi, I'm Daniel from Dope Chef Media. And
Hi.
Hi. I was wondering when you brought up that you'd get like these companies that you don't know asking you to do things. I was wondering like what do they ask for and like what is their offer?
There's a whole range there. It's interesting. So a lot of the time people will just want to send me things for free for me to post about. And when I had that really started pretty much as soon as I hit 10,000 followers, people were like, hey, you want free stuff? And I'd be like, yeah, I'd love free stuff. And people would send me stuff. And then if I didn't like it, I wouldn't post about it. And then they messaging me being like, oh, hey, you didn't shout us out. I'm like, oh yeah, these were pretty shit. I don't really want to tell myself, and I can legit just use it as I would and then be like, hey, yeah, this is a thing I'm using. And it's not a cheesy sell or it's not whatever. I'm just saying, yeah, I like this product. And I think that's been a better way. But somebody wanted to send me a free t-shirt, but I had to sign a contract to pay. And there's a huge range of what people are willing to pay. It's really interesting. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay, sweet. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, sweet. Okay.
All right. Yes, because the next presenter is Munchies. As I go for Munchies, I should be ruining my appetite.
Thank you.
We've been friends for years. So if you're on social media, check out Tweedledube on Instagram and on Snapchat and on
Twitter and Facebook and
all
Tumblr. All of the things.
All of the things.
All of the things.
And she is definitely moving in the sphere of the online world in a way that most people don't actually get to see. So
thank you, Tracy. Yeah. I also have tweedledube.com, and I have a story.
Because you can get. Because here's the thing. There's a reason that the name Tweedledube is different. So if you guys have ever seen the little Jolly Joint pins, that is also known.
Got a bunch in my purse too.
That is also known as a Tweedledube pin. And if you're a fan of Beck or Roger James, the artist, you will also know Marley quite well. She helps inspire some of his artwork, which is amazing. So thank you very much, Marley.
Thank you.
All right. So we are going to take a little bit of a break today, and talking to you about how to microdose your cannabis into your daily meals. So just stay tuned, and we'll get set up right up soon. Bye.